Let's do what we've signed up to do, which is work together. At the end of the day, this is not going to be a Republican plan or a Democrat plan or a Senate plan or a House plan. It is going to be a plan that allows us to govern. And with that, Mr. President, I thank you and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I ask, got two requests here. First, ask unanimous consent to extend the period of morning business for debate only until 7 p.m. and that all provisions of the previous order remain in effect.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I have three unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I want to follow up on the colleagues of, I think some of the senators have spoken before me. Seems like we've accepted this new normal that shutting down the operations of the largest enterprise in America is acceptable. I want to concur with a colleague, the Senator from Alaska, about the real stories and real pain that's taking place because of this government shutdown. And I commend some of my colleagues' comments who, when we read these tragic stories, whether it's around NIH, or around our veterans, or around our Park Service, say, oh, but that part of the government we want to reopen. Does that mean, Mr. President, that every other aspect of government remains closed until we can find that story? I point to my colleagues, stories that were in both the Washington Post and the New York Times today, a story that we should be celebrating about 3 American Nobel Prize winners. Well, should that mean we should now reopen the NSF? Because if the National Science Foundation isn't funded, there may not be a next generation of American Nobel Prize winners. We have to bring in a story about some child being hurt because their food or their meat or their fish wasn't inspected correctly. I got to tell you, I spent a lot longer in business than I have in politics. And I've been involved in a lot of business negotiations. But I've never been involved in a negotiation that says, during the negotiation, we have to shut down the operations of our business and inflict pain not only upon our employees, but upon the general economy across the board. That is not the way to govern. And I would agree, we've talked about stories to our federal workers, but I would agree again with the Senator from Alaska. It's also the hotel owners along the Skyline Drive in our state of Virginia, the government contractors who start and stop because they don't understand what government's going to operate. The story I heard this morning of a small business outside a government facility in St. Louis. This piecemeal effect, this piecemeal approach to reopening government makes no sense. What might be better would be hear from some of those folks who want to have this piecemeal effect, what parts of the government should stay closed. This is not the way to operate. We ought to reopen this government, put our people back to work, get this economy going again, and continue the very real conversations we've got to have about getting our fiscal house in order. And what makes this, to me, in the 4.5 years I've been in the Senate, different than these previous discussions and debates, is that we have this, first in my tenure in the Senate, government shutdown, which disproportionately is hurting Virginia and Maryland, but is literally hurting every community across America. But we have this tragedy, this catastrophe, merging now into a deadline that's going to hit us next week, where there are certain members of Congress who say it's okay if America defaults. I find that stunning. If you look back, there has never been a major industrial country in modern history that has defaulted. Matter of fact, the last major country to default was Argentina back in December of 2001. In the aftermath of that default, they had over 100% per annum inflation. Every family in Argentina saw literally 60% of their net worth disappear within a few weeks. Now, America's not Argentina. But why would we even get close to that kind of potential economic catastrophe? And as has been mentioned already, America holds a record as the reserve currency for the world. When crises happen, as we've happened around the world recently, in many countries, people and capital flows into the dollar. That's because the dollar and the United States' full faith and credit has never been suspect. It's never been a question of whether we're going to honor our commitments. Well, Mr. President, next week or very shortly after, that history is going to be put potentially in jeopardy. And I just got to tell you, I have heard those who say, well, we can prioritize payments. There is no business group in America or no economist that I know of, mostly from left to right, who believes that somehow America can partially default in prioritized payments. We're going to pay interest. We're going to pay our troops. Those of us who've served at state levels realize that sometimes our budgets are close to 50% pass-throughs from the federal government. The presiding officer, governor of the great state of West Virginia. How long before West Virginia defaults if America starts prioritizing its payments? How many other Detroits will there be all across America if we were to take this type of irresponsible action? And even if there was some possibility that there might be some chance of some logic behind this partial payment scheme, it's never been tried before. No industrial country has ever got this close to a default. Why would we take the chance? Why would we play Russian roulette with only one bullet and two chambers? Something that at this moment for our national economy and the world economy could be devastating. So, Mr. President, I know seem to be all repeating ourselves on both sides, but to me it seems pretty easy in a negotiation. We've got differences. I would say to my colleagues, I've probably made folks on my side more angry than almost anyone else on these issues around getting our country's balance sheet in order. I'm anxious to continue those discussions about tax reform, about entitlement reform, about bringing our debt-to-GDP ratio down. But not only has that kind of negotiation while you've got the government shut down and the full faith and credit of the United States potentially in jeopardy. So let's open the government, not just because we hear some tragic story about one component of the government, not just because we need to come and make that case about food inspectors, about National Science Foundation, about NASA Langley, where we do aeronautics research, 3,500 people, 7 people were at work last week. China, India, other nations around the world are not stopping their research, not stopping their investments because we can't get our act together. Open this government, take off the table the idea that America would default, and then I am anxious to join with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to get our country's balance sheet in order. But to continue to hold this economy and these stories of these Americans' lives in this limbo is irresponsible beyond words. So, Mr. President, I hope that we will go ahead and agreeing with my colleagues who've spoken already. Let's get this government open. Let's take and make sure that we're going to honor and pay our debts. And let's get to the very, very real, important questions of how we get our nation's balance sheet right. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I want to again thank the Majority Leader for bringing to the attention of this body the tragedy of those servicemen who lost their lives, and the fact that unfortunately they have been notified improperly, I believe, that they will not be, their families will not be being paid the tax-free death gratuity that they are entitled under law. This is wrong, Every member of this body agrees this is wrong. Every Republican agrees it is wrong, and I'm confident every Democrat agrees it is wrong as well. And indeed, the way this announcement was made was highly troubling. The Department of Defense notified our military families via Twitter that those service members who die in battle will not be paid their tax-free death gratuities due to the partial federal government shutdown. I think this is yet another pattern that we have seen distressingly from the Obama administration of politicizing this shutdown and playing partisan games to maximize the pain that is inflicted on Americans. It is part and parcel with the pattern we've seen barricading the World War II memorial, barricading the parking lot at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, even though Mount Vernon is privately operated, barricading the roads leaving Mount Rushmore, even though they are state roads and not federal roads. And the actions by the Department of Defense are also contrary to the statute that this body just passed. The military death gratuity is by statute a pay and personnel benefit. And accordingly, it is clearly funded by Public Law 113-39, the Pay Our Military Act that was passed in a bipartisan manner this week. We already acted to prevent this, and unfortunately, the Defense Department is declining to follow that law that we passed. The legislation that this body already passed would immediately act to take the families of those soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines whose lives are tragically taken, to take them off the table and say, regardless of what happens in a government shutdown, we're going to stand by the men and women fighting for America. And indeed, the House of Representatives has introduced a bipartisan bill to immediately fund death gratuity payments. When that bill is passed, the Senate should pass that bill immediately. Indeed, the Pentagon should abandon this policy to begin with and simply follow the law that was already passed. But if they don't, I call upon all 100 senators to come together to listen to the Majority Leader, who spoke powerfully about the need to stand by our servicemen and women whose lives are tragically taken. And when the House passes that bill, which I am confident it will do so with considerable speed, I would call upon every senator to listen to the Majority Leader's call and to stand with our servicemen and women. But there's something else we can do right here today to demonstrate that this body doesn't have to be locked in partisan gridlock, to demonstrate that bipartisan cooperation is possible, and to demonstrate that our veterans are truly not the subject of partisan dispute, but are separate and deserve to be treated fairly, deserve to have the commitments, the promises we made to our veterans honored. And that is, this body can stop blocking the legislation that the House of Representatives has already passed, bipartisan legislation, to fund the VA, to fund disability payments so that we don't hold them hostage to what's happening in Washington. And accordingly, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of H.J. Res. 72, making continuing appropriations for veterans' benefits for fiscal year 2014, that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, the distinguished senator from Texas has stated again what has already been talked about here a lot, and that is a piecemeal approach to funding our government. As do most Americans, we Democrats support the purpose of this bill to fund the Veterans Administration. But there's no reason for us to have to choose between this important government function, disease control, NIH, highway safety, FBI, poor children, workplace safety, or protecting the environment. We can do all these things if the House Republican leadership would just allow the House to vote on the Senate passed measure and end the shutdown. Everyone knows the votes are there. Our position is simple. open the government, pay our bills, and then we'll be happy to negotiate about anything. We need to end this government shutdown. Now, Mr. President, first of all, my friend talks about these 5 families who are in bereavement, and that is an understatement. 5 sons, husbands, friends were killed over the weekend. Providing the funding that my friend requests would not enable DOD to pay death gratuity for the families. Of 17 members, 5 over the weekend, we've had others die, who've given their lives to protect the nation since the shutdown began on October 1st. 17. This is but one example of how the Senator from Texas' efforts to fund the government on a piecemeal basis doesn't work. If the Speaker allowed the House to pass the Senate continuing resolution, the Department of Defense would have the authority that it needs to bring families to Dover, Delaware, to receive the remains of their families and pay the death gratuity benefits. The junior senator from Texas expresses concern for Americans' veterans. But his consent request addresses only some of the things in which the American people, through their government, have committed to help our veterans. Let me quote from the remarks of the senator from Connecticut, Senator Murphy. He gave those remarks on the 3rd of October. Here's exactly what he said. I would note that I believe the resolution the Senator is offering and suggested be passed provides only partial funding for the VA. There is no funding here to operate the national cemeteries, no funding for the Board of Veterans Appeals, there's no funding for constructing VA hospitals and their clinics, there's no funding actually to operate the IT system that the entire VA needs in order to continue going forward. So, Mr. President, there couldn't be a better example of why we are involved in this. Why couldn't we just open the government? Veterans benefits have our former colleague, former senator from Georgia, Max Cleland, a decorated, disabled American veteran who runs the cemeteries, do his job. He can't do that now. Let's get it all over with. Let's have the NIH go forward. Let's have the Centers for Disease Control, the Park Service. We can't have this piecemeal approach because you wind up with the same situation we now find ourselves. We want to do something for the veterans, but it doesn't take care of much of what the veterans need. So, Mr. President, I ask that my friend's amendment be modified, that the joint resolution as amended be read a 3rd time passed, and the motion be considered made and laid on the table with no any action or debate. This amendment is the text that passed the Senate and is a clean, continuing resolution for the entire government, everything. Veterans, their cemeteries, their benefits, everything, and is something that is already over in the House and reportedly has the support of a majority of the members of the House of Representatives. So I would ask my friend to really surprise the world, surprise the country, and let's say, I agree, modify it. Let's fund the government. And then, Mr. President, as we have said, I have said, everyone listen, we're happy to, when the government is open, when we can pay our bills, to sit down and talk about anything they want to talk about. It doesn't matter. No restrictions.
So modify his request.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I would ask unanimous consent that the Majority Leader and I be able to engage in a colloquy so that we may perhaps be able to, as the Majority Leader said, surprise the world by finding some avenues of bipartisan cooperation.
Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, I am happy to sit down and talk to the Senator, his office or my office. The point we have right here today is that we need the government open. And with all due respect to my friend, the junior senator from Texas, I want to say this in a most respectful way. He and I, with the dialogue back here on the Senate floor, we're not going to work this out. I have asked that the Senate open so that everyone can have benefits. The veterans measure that he proposes leaves many veterans out in the cold, including the families of 17 of our servicemen, families who were killed since this came into effect, this shutdown. So, Mr. President, we'll go as we have. I object to his proposal. I assume he'll object to mine, and then we'll go through the 10 minutes per person and see what happens later today. But I'm happy to sit down and talk to the President in my office, his office, any place he suggests, privately or publicly.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, was there
Will the senator so modify his request?
Mr. President, just a clarification. Was there objection to the request that we be able to engage in a colloquy? I wasn't clear to what the majority leader was objecting.
The senator is correct on that. Back to the normal order of 10 minutes each side. No. Is there objection to the modified request?
Well, Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I will note with regret that the majority leader objected to engaging in a discussion, to engaging in negotiations here on the Senate floor. I think that is unfortunate. So I will promulgate the questions that I would have asked him directly, and he may choose whether or not he wishes to answer them. The majority leader read from comments that Senator Murphy made on the Senate floor suggesting that the House bill funding the VA was not broad enough. I would note in my office we have drafted legislation that would fund the VA in its entirety. And if his objection it is not broad enough, I will readily offer that I would happily work with the majority leader to fund every bit of the VA as it is right now today, and we could introduce that bill. Indeed, I would be happy to have it labeled the Reed-Cruz bill and to give lead authorship to the majority leader.
Would the senator yield for a question?
I would be happy to yield for a question.
Would the senator be willing to take care of the 560,000 veterans who are federal employees, many of whom have now been furloughed?
I thank my friend from Illinois for that question, and indeed, I enthusiastically support the proposal that the House unanimously passed to give back pay to federal workers, and indeed, I would ask a question of the assistant minority leader, whether the Senate will even vote on that proposal, because there are 8 bills funding the federal government that are sitting on the majority leader's desk, and we have not been allowed to vote on any of them.
If the senator from Texas is asking me a question, I would respond through the chair that we have given the senator from Texas ample opportunity to completely fund the government, including all of the veterans who work for the federal government and all of the functions of the federal government, so we don't run into the embarrassment of these poor families in their bereavement being denied most basic benefits that our government gives. He has a chance to do that over and over again, and I believe he has declined that opportunity. So he bears some responsibility for the unfortunate circumstances we face.
And, Mr. President, I would note the fact that there are some issues on which we have partisan disagreements does not mean there are not other issues on which we can come together. I would note—
Would the senator yield for a question?
I am happy to yield to my friend for a question.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, through you to the senator from Texas, I'm wondering if your motion includes the full funding of the VA medical system, which is a completely government-run, government-controlled health care system.
I thank my friend for that question. As I said, I would readily support legislation fully funding the VA because the VA is a vital government system. It is a promise we have made, and it is unrelated to Obamacare. And my principal complaint this past week has been that the Democratic majority in this body is holding programs unrelated to Obamacare hostage in order to force Obamacare on everyone. We agreed for active duty military.
If my colleague, just so I am clear, Mr. President, if I might, just to clarify so that I understand, because the senator from Texas has, in fact, made the ending of a private sector competitive health care system for up to 30 million Americans part of what he wants to stop, I just wanted to be clear that the fully government-funded, government-run, with government doctors system through the Veterans Administration is something that you are advocating that we continue to fund through the federal government?
I thank my friend from Michigan for that question, and yet again, the answer is yes. I believe we should fully fund the VA. And the two questions that I would promulgate.
Is there objection to the modified request?
Reserving the right to object.
Mr. President?
Majority Leader. Is there objection to the modified request?
I would note the Majority Leader seems not to want to engage in debate, so I object, and I hope that the Majority Leader will start negotiating.
Regular order.
Objection is heard to the modified request. Is there objection to the original request?
Yes, I object. Mr. President?
Objection is heard.
Using later time. We have a number of people that are wishing to speak, and they should be able to do that. But I say as nicely as I can, the problem we have here is what people are saying, like my friend from Texas. Little bits and pieces of government. It won't work. We've got to open the government. And so, Mr. President, until that happens, we have to open the government. We have to make sure that we can pay our debts, and then we'll negotiate. I know he is fixed on Obamacare. We know that. But the problem is, Mr. President, that that's not going to change. And so I would hope that we could do what needs to be done. Open the government, make sure that we pay our bills, and then we negotiate. So I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I want to join with most of my colleagues that have talked about the urgency of us getting government open. It's causing great harm to our country. Make no mistake about it. It's hurting our economy. And I could talk about my own state of Maryland. Our governor has estimated that we're losing $15 million every day. So every day is precious. I could talk about over 100,000 federal workers in Maryland who are furloughed out of the 800,000 nationally, having a huge impact on our economy. This morning, Senator Boxer held a news briefing where we talked about the impact of the Environmental Protection Agency, where 93% of its employees have been furloughed. We can talk about the direct impact of those employees not being there. There was a representative from the Ding Darling refuge in Florida saying not only did it hurt the local economy directly, but she talked about one of the contract services that provide the touring service to the refuge had to lay off 20-some employees. So there's private sector jobs that are directly being lost as a result of this furlough. And it's going to be very difficult to get back that loss in our economy the longer the government shutdown lasts. It's wasteful to the taxpayers. The last shutdown cost the taxpayers $2 billion. Here we talk about conservatives who want to do something about the national debt, and they're wasting taxpayer dollars by keeping government closed. And yes, it is hurting our federal workforce. I join with Senator Mikulski in the comments that she made a little bit earlier. Our federal workforce has had to endure freezes in salaries, furloughs as a result of sequestration, freezes a number of employees that could be hired doing more work with less, and now furloughs again under a government shutdown. And those who are working don't know when they're going to get paid. It is not what we should be doing to our federal workforce. They have suffered, and this is wrong, and it is totally avoidable. The furloughs at the Environmental Protection Agency is jeopardizing our public health. We had experts come in today and talk about the fact that we don't have the people on guard to protect our waters, to protect our air, to protect our environment. It's jeopardizing public health. It's jeopardizing our environment. We had, I mentioned this morning, and let me mention again, the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, located in Maryland, on the eastern shore of Maryland, in Cambridge. This is a community in which that refuge is a huge part of their economy. This is a popular month for visitors to visit Blackwater. Well, the local businesses are hurting. The restaurants have less customers. the hotels, less rooms are being rented, and it goes on and on and on, the damage to our economy. Harbor Point is one of the most important economic developments in downtown Baltimore. It's a RCRA site, which means that it's under court order, requires the Environmental Protection Agency to sign off on the development plan. Well, we have a development plan. The City Council's acting. We're ready to move forward. But guess what? We can't get EPA to sign off on it because the people responsible are now on furlough. That's holding up economic growth and economic development in Baltimore. That's what this is doing. It's harming us. In the area of Maryland farmers in the Chesapeake Bay, Maryland farmers are doing what's right to try to help our bay. They depend upon the protections of the programs that are out there on soil conservation. The senator from Michigan knows how hard she's been working on the agricultural bill to provide the tools that are necessary to help our farmers be responsible farmers on land conservation. I received a call from a farmer near Centerville, Maryland on Monday that sums up pretty well how important the Natural Resources Conservation Service is to their work. This person is enrolled in the Conservation Stewardship Program, the CSP. That means that he is planting bumper crops in an effort to help us deal with the runoff issues of pesticides and insecticides into the bay, helping us and helping the bay. Now, he receives certain payments as a result of that participation in the program. He no longer is getting those payments. Now, we're asking him to make sacrifices, but we're not giving him the federal partnership. That's not right. He is hurt. He said, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to continue to do this? He told me he has a son with a medical condition that requires regular clinical eye treatment. He doesn't know whether he can afford that this month. And he was helping us with the environment, and now what do? We back off of what is necessary. Mr. President, I could give you many more examples. There's no piecemeal way that you can correct each one of those. On our foreign policy issues, I had the honor of chairing the East Asia Pacific Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Well, President Obama was supposed to be the headliner at the East Asia Economic Summit this past week. Guess who stole the headlines? President Xi of China, rather than our president. Asia is wondering whether America is open for business. We were missing at the table. That's no way for America to be conducting its business. We need to be open. We need to get government open. So, Mr. President, I hear my colleagues, we want to negotiate budget deals. I'm all for that. I think I have a reputation around here. People know that I'm interested in getting Democrats and Republicans together and getting a budget that makes sense for our country. But let me just, if I might, quote from the Baltimore Sun from this morning, because I think they say it better than I could say it. This is an exact quote from the Baltimore Sun about negotiations and how we have to go through negotiations. Passing a clean, continuing resolution keeping government fully operating at funding levels the GOP has already endorsed is no compromise. It's status quo. Raising the debt ceiling isn't a concession either. It allows the nation to pay the bills Congress has already incurred and prevents the possibility of a government default, which would hurt the economy, raise borrowing costs, and increase the federal deficit. So when Speaker Boehner lashes out at President Obama for failing to negotiate, one has to ask, what is this thing he describes as negotiations? House Republicans are not merely leveraging their political position, as some dryly claim. They are threatening to do grievous harm to the global economy and the American public. The gun isn't raised to President Obama's head or the Senate's. The Democrats have no particular stake in passing a continuing resolution or raising the debt ceiling other than keeping public order and doing what any reasonable person expects Congress to do. No, the gun is raised at the nation as a whole. That's why descriptions like ransom and hostage are not mere hyperboles. They are close as the English language gets to accurately describing the GOP strategy. The editorial ends by saying, it's time for Mr. Boehner to put down the gun and put more faith in the democratic process, end quote. Mr. President, we need to negotiate a budget for next year. We absolutely need to do it. We've tried to go to budget conference many times. The Majority Leader has repeated that request today. The formula for what is right for this country to do, and it's not one side getting advantage over another. The right thing to do is open government, pay our bills, and yes, let us negotiate a budget that will not be what the Democrats want, will not be what the Republicans want. We're going to have to compromise, as the framers of our Constitution envisioned that we would do. That's what we should have done months ago. You know, we passed our budget in March. We should have been negotiating months ago. But what we need to do right now is open government, pay our bills, and yes, then it's right for us to sit down and negotiate, and I can tell you we're ready to do that. But it's up to Speaker Boehner now to vote on the resolution that will keep government open, to vote on a way that we can make sure that we will continue to pay our bills, and then accept our offer to sit down and negotiate a budget for the coming year. That would be the best thing we can do for the American people. I urge my colleagues to urge the sense of urgency that we move this immediately because of the damage that we're causing to our country. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, there can be no doubt that no one wants to be here. Not one member of this body wants to be in shutdown. We all may have different reasons, different explanations as to why we're here. We might differ with regard to our own beliefs as to how best we should get out of this. But not one of us wants to be here, and every one of us recognizes how awful it is to be in a shutdown posture. I'd like to take a few moments and explain my thoughts on both of those 2 points. I believe that perhaps the single most important reason, the single most undisputable reason why we're in a shutdown posture has to do with the fact that for a variety of reasons we've been operating on the basis of continuing resolutions for several years in a row. A continuing resolution, of course, is a bill. It's a legislative vehicle through which Congress may choose to just keep government programs funded at current levels. It's kind of a reset button. It propels us forward on the basis of our current spending patterns rather than on the basis of an independently, freshly negotiated set of priorities. This is a different way of running government. Normally this is reserved for unusual circumstances, and it usually doesn't last as long as we've been going this time around, for about 4.5 years this way. But this causes us to do things in a way that is different than we would otherwise choose to do them. It's certainly very different than the manner in which we would operate in any other aspect of our lives. To use one familiar example, let's analogize Congress's spending patterns, its spending decisions, to a consumer going to the grocery store. Suppose that you went to the grocery store, having been informed by your spouse that you need to bring home bread, milk, and eggs. You went to that grocery store and you put bread and milk and eggs in your basket. You got to the checkout counter and you placed the bread and the milk and the eggs on the counter. The cashier rang you up. The cashier at that point said, okay, here's what you will owe us for these items, but we won't allow you to buy just bread, milk, and eggs. In order to buy these items at this store, we will also require you to purchase a half-ton of iron ore, a bucket of nails, a book about cowboy poetry, and a Barry Manilow album. Of course, anyone being told that would be a little surprised. Anyone being told that would be reluctant to shop at that same store in the future. And if another store existed, another alternative, very few, if any, consumers would continue shopping at that institution. And yet that in some ways is the way that we're asked to spend money here in Congress when we're operating on the basis of back-to-back continuing resolutions, just pushing reset on our spending button, keeping a federal government that spends about $3.7 trillion a year operating sort of on economic autopilot. It would actually be a little bit more of a close analogy if we changed the hypothetical to a circumstance in which the cashier said not just that you have to buy a half-ton of iron ore and a bucket of nails and a book about cowboy poetry and a Barry Manilow album, but you also have to buy one of every single item in the entire grocery store in order to buy anything. No bread, no milk, no eggs, nothing, unless you buy one of everything in the entire store. That would bring us a little bit closer to the analogy that we're dealing with here, where we have to choose to fund everything or, alternatively, to fund nothing. Neither one of those, it seems to me, is a terribly good solution. Neither one of those fairly represents good decision-making practices. We ought to be able to proceed as past Congresses have. Historically, passing a dozen or so, sometimes more, appropriations bills, going through our federal government category by category, debating and discussing each appropriations measure, to discuss the contents of that measure, to make sure that there is sufficient agreement within this body and within the House of Representatives to continue funding the government function in question. We have a new item in the store, so to speak, as we're shopping this year. A new item in the store, an item called Obamacare, one that's about to take full effect on January 1st, 2014. Yes, it's the law of the land, but we do have the final choice, the final option, the final authority to choose whether or not to fund that moving forward, or alternatively to defund it. We can take that out of the grocery cart. It's a new item that's caused a lot of people a lot of concern. A lot of people are fearing and experiencing job losses, cuts to their wages, having their hours slashed, or losing their health care benefits as a result of this law. And they see more of these disturbing trends coming in the near future. And so they're asking for Congress to help. They're asking for Congress to defund the implementation of this law. Now, a lot of people, many of my colleagues in this body have responded by saying, yes, but it's the law. Well, that's true. It was passed by Congress 3.5 years ago and signed into law by President Obama. It's important to remember two facts about this, however. First of all, the President himself has announced that he's not following the law. He himself says the law is not ready to implement as it's written. He himself has refused to follow it as it's written. Secondly, it's not unusual, it's not unheard of by any means to have a law that puts in place one standard, one program, and then have a subsequent appropriations decision made by Congress, a decision that results in the defunding of that very program. To cite one of many, many examples that we could point to, under federal law, currently there is designated something known as the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Depository. That is our official nuclear waste depository, and yet for many years it has been defunded by the Congress. That is Congress's prerogative. Congress holds the power of the purse. Congress may decide to do that. It's important also to remember that this was by design that it would work this way. Our founding fathers understood and set up the system so that it would work this way. And they put the power of the purse in the hands of the House of Representatives, understanding that the House of Representatives would act first when exercising the power of the purse. James Madison acknowledged this fact in Federalist number 58, and if I can quote from that in pertinent part, James Madison wrote, "The House of Representatives cannot only refuse, but they alone can propose the supplies requisite for the support of government. They, in a word, hold the purse, that powerful instrument by which we behold in the history of the British Constitution an infant and humble representation of the people, gradually enlarging the sphere of its activity and importance, and finally reducing as far as it seems to have wished all the overgrown prerogatives of the other branches of government. The power over the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure." So we find ourselves now in a position in which the House of Representatives is wanting to get the government funded again, is acting to keep the government funded on a step-by-step basis, starting with those areas as to which there is a broad-based bipartisan support, those areas of government that have nothing to do with the implementation and enforcement of Obamacare. Moving step by step in this fashion, we can get the government funded again. We
the rest of American citizens are non-essential as well. She goes on to say our struggles are real-life struggles, not aims, not philosophical, not in theory, not distant, and not imaginary. My hope is that these struggles and hardships matter to you. This is your duty, this is your charge, this is your enormous task. Shutting down the government is not a responsible action. That's what we're hearing from the people in my state, the people all over the country. It's time to end the shutdown, and I will continue to urge my colleagues in the House to do the right thing and pass the straightforward bill that the Senate passed on September 27th that would get the government back to work, get those employees back to their jobs. It's great that the House passed a bill to pay them. That's a good thing. But now they are paying them to stay home. They are paying them to not do their job. They want to come back to work. But as you know, Madam President, we are now facing another critical deadline, the deadline for paying our bills or facing default. Next Thursday, on October 17th, our country will hit its legal borrowing limit. And when that happens, we will be asked to do what Congress has routinely done 70 times over the past 50 years, and that's pay our country's bills. Let me be clear, this is about making good on commitments we've already made. This is about doing what regular Americans do every month when they pay their credit card bills. And yet, lately, we've heard voices from the other side, from a number of people who seem to think this is just no big deal. Just the other day, Republican Congressman Joe Barton of Texas said, quote, some bills have to be paid, and some bills we can defer and only pay partially, but that doesn't mean that we have to pay every bill the day it comes in. Then there was Dan Mitchell, a senior fellow at the conservative Cato Institute, who says, quote, there's no need to fret. No need to fret. That is not what history teaches us. As chair on the Senate side of the Joint Economic Committee, I had a hearing a few weeks ago about the cost of this brinkmanship, about what happens if we go over that cliff, if we let our bills go, if we don't pay them. Let's turn back to 2011. We have a very clear lesson of what happens when the mere prospect of a default sends shockwaves through our economy. I recently released a report examining the fallout of that brinkmanship. The results were ugly. The Dow Jones plummeted more than 2,000 points. Our credit rating was downgraded, and $2.4 trillion in American household wealth was wiped away. Now, I think it's important for everyone to remember that in 2011, all of this happened before we averted default. The Treasury Secretary sent a letter to Congress about the looming debt ceiling starting on January 6, 2011. On May 2nd, he announced that the debt limit would be reached on August 2nd. That was the magic day, August 2nd. Now we have people that are saying, well, maybe it's not October 17th. They were saying that back then. But do you know what happened in the lead up to August 2nd? On July 14th, Standard & Poor's warned that it may downgrade the U.S. credit rating. They followed through on that. They downgraded it after the magic day of August 2nd, but it was 2 weeks before that they warned that they might do it. What happened then? Well, over late July and early August, leading up to the date, the Dow Jones dropped more than 2,000 points. So the next time someone says there's no need to fret over playing games with the debt ceiling, tell them to talk to the families whose retirement plans took a hit. Make no mistake, this brinkmanship has very real consequences for our economy. We can't afford to go down this path again because this time around the fall could be so much harder. Our Joint Economic Committee analysis indicates that rates could rise on everything from credit cards and home mortgages to borrowing costs for businesses. At a time when our economy is finally turning a corner, this would put a real strain on families and small business owners. But don't take my word for it. Secretary Lew has said that extraordinary measures will be exhausted by mid-October. Already our government is not matching the retirement funds that federal workers put in. Already they are not issuing some of the municipal bonds. Already they are not making some of the typical investments they would normally make. And the business community, and my friends on the other side of the aisle know this, is overwhelmingly opposed to the idea of letting America not pay its bills, including key leaders like Randall Stephenson, the CEO of AT&T, who said, quote, It is unthinkable that the U.S. could default, and it would be the height of irresponsibility for a public official to consider such a course. Our country, Madam President, cannot afford to keep lurching from crisis to crisis. It's time for both parties to focus on real solutions that get the government back to work in the short term so that we can focus on responsibly reducing our deficit in the long term. I supported the work of the Gang of Six, the work of the Gang of Eight, the work that was being done by the Domenici-Rivlin Commission, the work that was being done by the Debt Commission. I was one of 14 senators who pushed for that work to be done, and I think it is a great basis. I don't agree with everything in it, but it is a good start for how we can negotiate a major deal. We cannot do that in the next few days. We need that time to do it, and that is why the Senate proposal is 6 weeks. 6 weeks to allow the government to open up again so we can truly negotiate the kind of long-term debt reduction deal that we should. We need to be forward-looking, Madam President. We need to be forward-looking enough to recognize that the decisions we make today go far beyond the next election cycle. They will be felt by generations to come, and we have a responsibility to get things right. We can't allow our country to go over the brink. It's not the American way. In a 1987 address to the American people, President Ronald Reagan said, when he was talking about the debt ceiling and the need to pay our country's bills, he said, "The United States has a special responsibility to itself and the world to meet its obligations. It means we have a well-earned reputation for reliability and credibility, two things that set us apart from much of the world." I urge my colleagues to take these words seriously, to join me in ensuring that Congress acts responsibly and in the best interest of this country. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam President. I would ask that 10 minutes be divided between myself and the senior senator from Texas, Senator Cornyn.
Is there objection? Without objection. Well, I'm sorry, is there objection?
Thank you, Madam President. Not to object. I just wanted to clarify and ask that if we might expand that to indicate the order in which I believe we've agreed on the floor after our two colleagues, that I would be allowed to speak after my two distinguished colleagues, and then Senator Whitehouse and then Senator Coburn.
Will the senator modify her request?
Absolutely. I would modify my request to reflect what the senior senator from Michigan said.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I rise today. I think it's time for us to end this government shutdown. And here's where we are. I said on the floor twice last week and prior to that I didn't think that the strategy of defunding Obamacare was a strategy that would be successful. And while I support repealing and replacing Obamacare because I've seen the negative impact in my own state of New Hampshire, we've already seen that the government is shut down, and yet the Obamacare exchanges have opened, showing already many of the problems that with those exchanges, with the computer system, what are called glitches, but are major flaws at this point. So where we find ourselves, it is time for both sides to come together and resolve this on behalf of the American people. I've seen in my home state of New Hampshire not only what was discussed earlier on the floor today, let me just say that it's appalling that we have soldiers that have been killed in the line of duty and their families aren't receiving death benefits. It's wrong, it's outrageous. We need to solve that right away. But we need to solve this overall government shutdown. In New Hampshire, we have private campgrounds that contract with the White Mountain National Forest that are being closed despite the fact that they actually bring revenue into the Treasury and run these privately and actually make money for the federal government. And I think the administration is playing games with things like that and that they should open up those campgrounds. But ultimately, we have to get this government open. And I want to praise my colleague from Maine, Senator Collins, who came to the floor earlier today, the senior senator from Maine, with an idea that she has drawn from other senators, not only in this chamber but in the House of Representatives, of a way that we could resolve this impasse. And that is taking something that we have already voted on in this chamber, on the budget resolution. There was a vote in this chamber on the medical device tax repeal, and that vote got on the budget resolution 79-20. We voted on a bipartisan basis that we should repeal this tax. I've been against this tax since I campaigned because in New Hampshire, the impact on our companies, we see that it's going to increase health care costs. Companies like Smith's Medical, companies like Coreflex, many companies in New Hampshire are negatively impacted by this tax, and their workers are put in a difficult place when these companies can't expand or they have to reduce their workforce because of this onerous tax, which, by the way, is a tax on revenue, 2.3% tax on revenue, a tax on innovation and new ideas in health care rather than a tax on profit. But ultimately, we should repeal this tax. It's wrong. And so I want to support what my colleague from Maine came to the floor on today as something we should take up and discuss in this chamber. That is a repeal of the medical device tax with a pay-for, a CR proposed for a longer period of time. She's proposed 6 months within the Budget Control Act numbers, and flexibility for the agencies to address the sequester in the way that is best and most sensible for the American people. So I want to thank my colleague from Maine. We can come together and resolve this, and I hope that members on the other side of the aisle that voted for the medical device tax repeal, that we can work together along with members of the House of Representatives, that we can work this out, get the government open, and also address concerns that we have with Obamacare that is impacting an industry that's an important industry, the medical device industry, that provides innovation and important life-saving devices for people in this country. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, 4 times the House of Representatives has sent over continuing resolutions with various additions for consideration by the United States Senate. Each time, Senator Reid and the majority party have tabled those provisions, essentially shutting them down without giving them an opportunity for a vote on the merits. The last time, though, I believe Senator Reid really led his colleagues down a very treacherous path, because the provisions of this otherwise clean CR would have repealed the provision that carves out Congress and members of our staff and gives us preferential treatment under Obamacare. The second part of it has to do with delaying the penalties on individuals, just like the President has done in delaying the penalties on employers unilaterally. There is no good reason for us not to pass both of those provisions, but instead of trying to deal constructively with the House of Representatives, which has sent 4 separate bills over here on the continuing resolution, the majority leader has chosen to stiff-arm each of those efforts. And so when the majority leader comes to the floor and he bemoans the government shutdown, something that we all agree we should try our best to avoid, he claims that they are willing to negotiate and that the President's willing to negotiate a change in the outcome. But we know that's not true. We know that each time they have shut out Republican proposals from the House of Representatives that would open the federal government back up with reasonable bipartisan agreements. But what really is beyond belief is when I hear our colleagues come to the floor and they say, why can't we have cancer research for children at NIH continue? And we come to the floor, we offer bills that would open up that funding at the National Institutes of Health, that very same cancer research, and they're objected to by the Democratic side of the aisle. I don't know any other word to describe it other than hypocrisy. And then we read in the newspaper this morning, the Washington Post talks about the case of Michelle Langbin, who was diagnosed with sarcoma. She's from California, who's unable to get an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial at NIH. This is the very same sort of program that would have been funded by the bill that we offered on this side of the aisle and that was objected to by the majority leader and the Democratic side. There is one bright spot of agreement, and that is we were able to agree unanimously to pass the House bill that funded our troops, that passed the House 423-0. That's good news. But the bad news is that this is now all morphed into a debate not only the continuing resolution, but on the debt ceiling. And what the majority leader and this side of the aisle is apparently proposing is that without making any arrangements whatsoever to pay for the $17 trillion in debt that have already been accumulated, they want another clean debt ceiling increase, and the President says he won't negotiate about that. But we'll be voting in all likelihood later this week on another $1 trillion added to our maxed out credit card without doing anything whatsoever to take care of the debt that's already been incurred. Now, that is just fundamentally irresponsible. That's not me saying it. The American people have said this. The Congressional Budget Office has said this. The President's own Bipartisan Fiscal Commission has said that. One recent poll from NBC Wall Street Journal, when people were given the choice between raising the debt ceiling or not raising the debt ceiling, 44% said don't raise the debt ceiling. 22% said raise the debt ceiling. Now, I realize we have more choices than that. There could be coupled together with the raising of the debt ceiling some real reforms of our broken entitlement programs to shore up Social Security and Medicare. But our colleagues, and the President of the United States himself, has said, no, I'm not going to negotiate. No, I want a clean debt ceiling. No, I want the freedom to max out the credit card another $1 trillion without doing anything to pay off the debt that threatens our country, not only our future prosperity, but our national security. I remember very clearly Admiral Mike Mullen, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he was asked what the greatest national security threat to the United States there was, and he said the national debt. Why would our colleagues, why would the President of the United States ignore what the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called the most significant national security threat to our country by saying we're not interested in any reforms, we're not interested in anything that would actually pay down the debt and remove that threat to our national security and our future prosperity? Why would they want to say, no, we want to keep on spending money we don't actually have, continuing borrowing from our creditors like China and other foreign countries that hold a majority of our national debt? And you know what would happen and what will happen when interest rates start to tick back up again as the Federal Reserve begins to taper its purchases of our own debt. We're going to see more and more of our national expenditures go to paying interest on that debt, crowding out not only national security, but the safety net programs for the most vulnerable people in our country. Madam President, I would yield the floor.